We gave you every opportunity, and you threw it away. Mom sobbed dramatically in court. Dad nodded. My lawyer stayed calm. Then Judge Harrison stopped reading, looked up slowly. Wait. I read about this company in Forbes last week. Someone here is lying to my face. The words hung in the air, sucking the oxygen out of the room. I had expected betrayal to be loud, screaming, and slamming doors. But this specific cruelty was quiet enough to steal my breath away completely. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. My mother's soft weeping cut off instantly, her hand freezing halfway to her face, where she had been dabbing at dry eyes. Beside her, my father went rigid, his posture shifting from righteous indignation to something brittle and terrified. They had come here expecting a funeral for my ambitions. Dressed in somber black to mourn the daughter they claimed had failed them, only to find the grave empty. Marcus, my brother, was the only one who didn't immediately understand the tectonic shift. He sat at the plaintiff's table, checking his watch, likely calculating how soon he could liquidate my assets. He had filed the petition with such confidence, listing debts that didn't exist and loans I never took. To him, this courtroom was just a formality, a rubber stamp on the narrative he had sold our parents. He hadn't bothered to look up at the judge sitting high above him yet. I looked at the man on the bench. Judge Harrison wasn't looking at the weeping mother or the stoic father. He was staring at the file in his hands, his brows creating a deep furrow above wire-rimmed glasses. He turned a page, the sound crisp and violent in the stillness. It wasn't the petition Marcus had filed. It was the supplemental evidence my lawyer, Elena, had submitted only 10 minutes before the session began without a single word of warning. Elena sat beside me, a statue of calm in a room rapidly descending into panic. She didn't look triumphant or smug. She simply smoothed the fabric of her suit jacket and waited for the gravity to take hold. We hadn't sent a cease and desist or a counter offer. We had let them walk into this room, believing their own lies were bulletproof. Silence, she had told me weeks ago, was not just protection anymore, it was the ultimate strategy. Mr. Whitmore, the judge said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated through the floorboards. Marcus finally looked up, his arrogant boredom flickering into confusion. You state here that the defendant's company, Aether Systems, is insolvent and has defaulted on a $2 million personal loan. The judge held up the magazine, the glossy cover catching the harsh fluorescent lights. Yet this article describes a solvent, high-growth firm with reserves exceeding your entire claim. The visual evidence was undeniable and absolutely damning. Marcus's attorney stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Your Honor, media reports are often exaggerated. My client has detailed ledgers. It was a weak deflection, and he knew it. I watched the color drain from his face as he realized he had been led into a trap by his own client's fabrication. He looked at Marcus, then at the judge, assessing how much professional damage he was about to sustain in the next 5 agonizing minutes. The judge removed his glasses, setting them down on the mahogany surface with a deliberate click. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together. I am not looking at a media report, counselor. I am looking at audited financials that contradict every single word in your filing. He turned his gaze to my mother, then my father, and finally settled on me. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the accused. I finally felt like the executioner. To understand the silence in that courtroom, you have to understand the noise of my childhood. We weren't a broken home on paper. We were the family neighbors pointed to while saying, "They have it all figured out." My father ran a legacy financial firm in Boston, loving structure and predictability above all else. My mother curated perfect dinners and timed her smiles like stage cues. Then there was Marcus, the golden hair, born to inherit a kingdom he never earned. I was just the extra furniture. While Marcus practiced his golf swing for networking events, I spent my teenage years dismantling toasters and rewriting code. He talked about portfolios and handshakes. I was fascinated by how systems broke and how to bulletproof them against invisible threats. I saw patterns where my family only saw static. But in the Whitmore house, curiosity was a liability if it didn't wear a suit. My parents praised Marcus for projects he hadn't finished, while my completed work sat unnoticed on the kitchen counter, gathering dust. The break happened over a Sunday roast 5 years ago. I was 22, fresh out of college, and foolish enough to think merit mattered. I started sketching a logistics algorithm on a linen napkin, trying to explain how it could optimize Dad's supply chain clients. My father watched me for a minute, cutting his meat with surgical precision. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's a cute phase, Grace," he said, wiping his mouth. "You'll grow out of playing business soon." My mother laughed lightly, a tinkling sound that signaled the subject was closed. "Eat your potatoes, dear," she added. Marcus was telling us about his new internship. The napkin remained on the table, stained with gravy, a physical monument to my irrelevance. That night, I realized their love was conditional. I was smart, but not hair material. I was talented, but not in the way that looked good at a country club. I stopped trying to prove I fit. Instead, I decided to leave. When I moved out, there were no screaming matches or slammed doors. I just packed my sedan and drove until the skyline changed. I married James, took his last name, and erased the Whitmore from my professional identity. For 3 years, my world shrank to the size of a folding table in a drafty apartment. I traded networking dinners for cold coffee and code that refused to compile. I built Aether systems in the dark, line by agonizing line, fueled by a desperate need for autonomy. There were months when we debated between paying the internet bill or buying fresh produce. I learned to survive on focus and stubbornness, feeding on the silence my family mistook for failure. When I did see them for holidays, I wore the same coat and drove the same dented car. They took this as confirmation of their worldview. Marcus would clap me on the shoulder, offering unsolicited advice about entry-level roles, while my father asked if I needed a loan to cover rent. "We just want you to be stable," Mom would say, pressing a $50 bill into my hand like I was a child. "There is no shame in admitting you are lost." I took the money because refusing it would spark a conversation I wasn't ready to have. It felt safer to let them believe I was struggling than to show them I was building something they couldn't control. Their pity was a heavy blanket, suffocating but predictable. I hid behind it while my company quietly ignited. Then came the contract that changed everything. A major logistics firm licensed my software, and suddenly, the bank account numbers had commas. I remember staring at the deposit notification, my thumb hovering over my mother's contact in my phone. I wanted to call her. I wanted to hear her say she was proud. But then I remembered the napkin. I remembered Marcus's smirk. If I told them, the success wouldn't be mine anymore. It would become something for them to manage, critique, or claim. I put the phone down and never made the call. James looked at me from across the table, understanding the choice without me saying a word. We celebrated with a bottle of cheap wine, keeping the victory locked inside our walls. That silence became my armor. But I didn't realize it was also a weapon. By keeping them in the dark, I allowed their arrogance to grow unchecked. I let them believe the lie, until it was too late for them to see the truth. 6 months ago, the confirmation arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. A Tier 1 logistics giant offered to acquire a minority stake in Aether, placing the company's valuation at 8 figures. I sat in my car outside a coffee shop, watching the rain blur the windshield, staring at the number on my phone screen. It was enough money to buy my parents' house 3 times over. I didn't scream or call James immediately. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. If this got out, the quiet life I had built was over. I became a ghost online. I scrubbed my personal LinkedIn, kept the company press releases vague, and attributed quotes to my co-founder. I knew how my family operated. They tracked status, like bloodhounds tracked a scent. If they saw a headline with my name, they wouldn't see an achievement. They would see an asset they had failed to claim. I warned James to keep his mouth shut around mutual friends. We lived in a paradox of massive private success and public destitution. It worked, until the algorithms betrayed me. Marcus started the probing a week later. It wasn't direct at first. Just little messages slipping into the family group. Chat like poisonous snakes. Heard the tech sector is volatile right now, he wrote, followed by a sad face emoji. Must be stressful not having stability. He wasn't asking how I was, he was fishing for weakness. He wanted me to admit I was struggling so he could feel secure in his own stagnation. I replied with a thumbs up and nothing else. His silence was louder than an argument. Then my father called, which he never did unless someone had died, or he needed a signature. He skipped the pleasantries and went straight to a lecture on liability insurance. People like you often don't understand the consequences of debt. Grace, he said, his voice smooth and condescending. Risks compound. I realized he wasn't warning me about my business. He was warning me about his reputation. He sensed movement in my life, and movement, without his permission, felt like a threat to his order. I hung up feeling nauseous. The shift in their attention sharpened into a summons for dinner. My mother called it a celebration of family, but her tone suggested an arraignment. I drove to the old house in Chestnut Hill, the tires crunching on the gravel driveway that always sounded like judgment. The house was lit up like a fortress. Inside, the air smelled of roast beef and expensive perfume, masking the scent of decay. Marcus was already there, pouring a drink, watching me walk in with eyes that looked too alert, too hungry. Dinner was a minefield of passive, aggressive inquiries. My mother passed the peas and asked if I had considered getting real help with my finances. She didn't mean an accountant, she meant my father. "We just worry you are overextended," she said, her voice dripping with that weaponized sweetness. "There are opportunities here, Grace. If you'd just ask." She wasn't offering support, she was offering a leash. I pushed the food around my plate, refusing to bite. I kept my answers vague, consulting, busy, paying the bills. Marcus finally dropped the pretense of concern during the dessert course. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his scotch. "I heard a rumor you landed something decent," he said, framing it as a joke. "Some little contract. Or are you just handling data entry for the big boys now?" His eyes searched my face, waiting for a expression of pride that would confirm his suspicions. He was measuring me. He needed to know if I had grown enough to overshadow him. I forced a shrug. "Just surviving, Marcus." The tension in the room spiked. They didn't believe me anymore. My father set his fork down, the clink echoing against the china. "Surviving isn't thriving, Grace," he said coldly. "We need to discuss your long-term viability. We can't have you embarrassing the family name with a public failure." The word failure was a bait. He wanted me to defend myself, to lay my cards on the table so he could swipe them. I saw the trap clearly now. They weren't afraid I would fail. They were terrified I wouldn't. I left that night with a migraine pulsing behind my eyes. I had dodged their questions, but I knew I hadn't escaped their radar. As I walked to my car, I looked back at the house. My mother was watching from the window, a silhouette framed in golden light, holding a phone to her ear. She wasn't waving goodbye. She was making a call. The feeling of safety I had built evaporated. They knew I had something valuable, and they were already deciding how to take it back. 2 weeks of silence followed that dinner, a vacuum that felt heavier than the arguments. I was standing in my hallway, keys still digging into my palm, when I saw it. The envelope was thick, official, and sitting heavily on the console table, where James had left the mail. My name was printed too cleanly on the front, not handwritten. It wasn't a birthday card or an invitation. It looked like government business. The air in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. I stared at it, terrified that touching it would make the nightmare real. I sliced the envelope open with a kitchen knife. The tearing sound sharp in the quiet apartment. I pulled out a stack of documents, the paper heavy and expensive. The first word that hit me was petition, then involuntary bankruptcy, then creditor. I read them again, my brain refusing to process the syntax. It wasn't a mistake or a misdelivered letter. It was a legal filing against me. Against Ather. My hands didn't shake, but my heart stopped beating for a terrifying second. The room spun slightly, then snapped into a horrific, razor-sharp focus. I walked to the kitchen island and spread the papers out like a map of a war zone. The petitioner wasn't a bank or a disgruntled vendor. It was Marcus Whitmore. Beside his name was a figure that made me gasp, $2 million. The filing claimed I had defaulted on a series of personal loans dating back 4 years. It listed dates, interest rates, and verbal agreements I had never made. It was a complete fabrication, yet it looked so official on the cream-colored page. It looked exactly like the truth. The petition didn't just claim I owed money. It claimed Ather Systems was insolvent. It argued that my company was a shell, mismanaged and bleeding cash, necessitating immediate court supervision to protect creditors. That was the true dagger. If this went public, or even entered the court record, my investors would panic. The logic was terrifyingly sound. They weren't just trying to get money from me. They were trying to freeze my assets. They were attempting to kill the company before it could fully bloom. I poured a glass of water, but my throat was too tight to swallow. I sat there, staring at the signatures. They looked confident, practiced. This wasn't a drunken text message or a moody outburst at a holiday party. This was paperwork. This required a lawyer, a filing fee, and a notary. Marcus had to sit down in an office, look a professional in the eye, and sign his name to a lie. The premeditation made my stomach turn. This wasn't an emotional lashing out, it was a cold business transaction. I flipped to the exhibits attached to the back. There were affidavits. One was from my mother. It was short, expressing deep concern for my financial instability and confirming the existence of family support that had been squandered. My father hadn't signed one, but his fingerprints were all over the legal strategy. The aggression, the focus on liability. The attempt to establish guardianship over my finances. It was his playbook. Marcus was just the soldier. My parents were the generals. The betrayal wasn't just partial. It was absolute and total. The front door opened, and James walked in, humming a tune that died the second he saw my face. He looked at the papers spread across the granite counter. I couldn't speak, so I just pointed. He read the first page, his brow furrowing, then the second. "This is insane," he whispered, tossing the packet down. "Grace, they can't prove this. We have records. We have audits." He was right, but he was missing the point. They didn't need to win on the merits. They just needed to create enough doubt. I realized exactly what they wanted. They didn't want the $2 million, because the money didn't exist. They wanted a settlement. They wanted me to panic, come running back to the house, and trade equity in my company for their silence. They wanted to force me into a position where Daddy could step in and fix the mess they had created, effectively taking control of everything I built. It was a hostile takeover disguised as a family intervention. They were betting everything on my fear. I looked at the date on the filing. The hearing was set for next week. They had timed it perfectly to minimize my ability to prepare. James reached for my hand, his grip tight and warm, but I pulled away. I wasn't looking for comfort anymore. I picked up my phone and dialed the number of a lawyer I had met once at a conference. A woman known for destroying bullies. I wasn't going to call my parents. I wasn't going to ask why. I was going to start a war. Elena's office was a fortress of glass and steel overlooking the harbor, designed to intimidate opponents before they even sat down. She didn't offer me coffee or sympathy when I arrived. She simply extended a hand, took the folder, and began reading in silence. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic tapping of her stylus against a tablet screen as she made notes. I sat on the edge of the leather chair, watching her face for a flicker of doubt. The view was expensive, but the silence was free. "This is sophisticated," Elena said finally, sliding the papers back across the desk. "They aren't just suing you for money, Grace. They've filed for an involuntary, Chapter 7 liquidation." She tapped the specific code on the page. "This freezes your ability to transfer assets or sign new contracts immediately. It's a compliance chokehold designed to panic your board and force a quick resignation. Her voice was devoid of alarm, which somehow made the danger feel more acute. They weren't just shaking the tree, they were poisoning the roots. I opened my laptop and pulled up the forensic audit I had commissioned the night before. "These are my bank statements for the last 5 years," I said, turning the screen toward her. "Every deposit, every withdrawal. There is no $2 million entry. There is no loan." The screen glowed with the cold, hard blue of clean data. Elena scanned the columns, her eyes narrowing. Absence of evidence isn't always proof of innocence in civil court, she warned, looking up. "We need to prove the debt is impossible." "Look at the dates," I said, pointing to the claim form. Marcus claims he transferred the first installment on the 14th of November, 4 years ago. I pulled up a saved email chain from that same month. On the 14th of November, Marcus was asking me for rent money because he had maxed out his credit cards on a ski trip. The irony was sharp enough to cut. He was claiming to be my savior during the exact week he was begging for my help. It was a verifiable, documented impossibility. Alina flipped to the promissory note, examining the signature at the bottom. It was my name, written in the looping script I had used since high school. "It looks authentic," she muttered, zooming in on the digital scan. "The pressure points are consistent with a right-handed signer." She looked up at me. "If you didn't sign this, Grace, then someone who knows your hand intimately did." The air in the room grew heavy. This wasn't just financial fraud. It was a deep, personal violation of my identity. I leaned in closer, studying the tail of the G in my name. It curled upwards slightly at the end. A flourish I had dropped years ago, but one my father still used in his own signature. My stomach dropped. Marcus hadn't just forged this. My father had likely guided the pen. It was a collaborative effort, a family project art, directed by the man who taught me to write. "It's not Marcus," I whispered, the realization tasting like ash. "He doesn't have the patience for this detail." Elena sat back, steepling her fingers. "We have enough to file a motion to dismiss immediately," she said. "We can submit these records, prove the fraud, and make this go away before the hearing." It was the sensible, safe option. It would protect the company and end the nightmare by Friday. But it felt like hiding. It felt like playing by their rules of secrecy. If I dismissed it now, they would just pivot to a new attack. I didn't want a shield, I wanted a sword. "No," I said, my voice steady for the first time in days. "If we file now, they withdraw and claim it was a clerical error. They save face." I looked at the city skyline, thinking of the years of silence I had swallowed. I want them in that courtroom, Alina. I want Marcus to swear under oath that these debts are real. I want my mother to cry on the stand. I turned back to her. I want the judge to ask them the hard questions. Not us. Elena stared at me for a long moment, assessing not just the case, but my resolve. A slow, terrifying smile spread across her face. "That is high risk," she said softly. "But if it works, it's nuclear." She closed the folder, the snap echoing like a gunshot in the quiet office. "We don't send a response. We let them think you are drowning, until the moment the bailiff calls your name." We shook hands over the wreckage of my family history, effectively sealing their fate. The courtroom air had shifted from a place of judgment to a theater of exposure. Judge Harrison did not return the file to the desk. Instead, he held it up like a weapon, the pages catching the sterile light. "Let us discuss the timeline," he said, his voice terrifyingly conversational. "Mr. Whitmore, you claim this loan originated 4 years ago, on November 14th. He paused, letting the date hang there. "A Tuesday." Marcus shifted in his seat, tugging at a collar that had suddenly become too tight. He nodded once, a jerky, nervous motion that betrayed everything. "Yes, Your Honor." Marcus stammered, his voice cracking on the last syllable. "I remember it clearly." She was desperate. The judge turned a page of the forensic audit Elena had submitted, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silence. "That is fascinating," Harrison replied without looking up. "Because according to these bank records, on that specific Tuesday, your personal checking account was overdrawn by $400. The judge finally looked at him. "You were unable to buy groceries. Yet you claim you wired $2 million. The math simply did not exist." Marcus's attorney shot to his feet, his composure fracturing under the weight of the evidence. "Your Honor, there may be a clerical error regarding the specific dates. My client manages multiple accounts." It was a desperate, flailing attempt to patch a sinking ship with paper. Judge Harrison lowered his glasses, fixing the lawyer with a glare that could peel paint. "Counselor," he warned, his tone dropping an octave. "I am looking at a subpoenaed history of every account under your client's name. There are no other accounts." The lie had nowhere left to hide. The judge picked up the magazine again, the glossy cover acting as a mirror to our collective absurdity. "And then there is the matter of insolvency," he continued. "This article values Aether systems at a figure that exceeds the GDP of some small nations." He looked at me then, really looked at me. "Miss Whitmore, is this accurate?" I stood up, feeling the gaze of my parents burning into my back. "It is conservative, Your Honor," I said clearly. "We closed a new round of funding yesterday." My voice was the only steady thing in the room. A murmur rippled through the gallery, low and dangerous. My mother stopped her performance of grief, her hand falling from her face as the calculation in her eyes shifted. She wasn't looking at me with pride. She was looking at me like a vault she had lost the combination to. Marcus, sensing the ground crumbling beneath him, tried to pivot. "It's a shell game," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She's hiding the debt in offshore accounts." "That article is a paid placement." His desperation was loud, ugly, and entirely unconvincing. Elena didn't shout back. She simply stood and handed the bailiff a single sheet of stiff paper. "Exhibit C, Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through Marcus's noise like a razor. "A forensic handwriting analysis conducted by a court-certified expert." The bailiff handed the document to the judge. We compared the signature on the promissory note against 20 known samples of the defendant's handwriting from the same year. Elena turned to look at my father. "The pressure points are inconsistent. The loop on the G is distinctive." She let the implication hang there. Judge Harrison studied the document, his eyes darting between the forged note and the analysis. He was seeing exactly what I had seen in Elena's office. The ghost of my father's hand puppeting my brother's greed. The expert concludes with 99% certainty that the defendant did not sign this. The judge read aloud. He looked at Marcus. Did you witness her sign this, Mr. Whitmore? Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at our father for help. But Dad was staring strictly ahead, studying the wood grain of the defense table. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Marcus was alone on an island of his own making, stranded by the very people who had pushed him there. I thought she signed it. Marcus whispered, the lie dissolving into incompetence. The paperwork was handled by family associates. It was a weak deflection, but it was enough to incriminate everyone without naming anyone. My father flinched. It was a microscopic movement, a tightening of the jaw, but from where I stood, it looked like a confession. The united front was shattered. Alina wasn't finished. We also have the metadata from the file creation, she added, twisting the knife. The promissory note was created on a computer registered to Whitmore Family Trust 3 weeks ago. She paused for effect. Backdating a document to create a liability for a bankruptcy petition is bankruptcy fraud, Your Honor. The words hung in the air, bankruptcy fraud. It carried the weight of prison time. Marcus's lawyer turned pale, realizing he had been made an accessory to a federal crime. He began packing his briefcase, mentally distancing himself from his client. The opposing counsel cleared his throat, his voice jumping an octave. Your Honor, in light of this new information, we request an immediate recess to confer with our client. It was the white flag. They wanted to retreat, regroup, and likely offer to withdraw the petition with prejudice in exchange for sealing the record. They wanted to bury the crime they had just exposed. Judge Harrison looked at Alina. Does the defense object to a brief recess? The room held its breath. This was the moment. I could let them run, or I could finish it. Alina looked at me. The choice was entirely mine. I looked at my mother, who was now gripping her purse with white knuckles, her eyes pleading for the first time. She mouthed the word please. It was the same look she gave when she wanted me to hide my grades to protect Marcus's ego. She wanted me to fix it, to cover for them one last time. I felt a phantom weight lift off my chest. I didn't hate them anymore. I just didn't care to save them from themselves. I shook my head. We object, Your Honor, Alina said, her voice ringing with finality. The petitioner chose to drag my client into this public forum to damage her reputation. We believe the record should reflect the truth of their claims today, without interruption. The judge nodded, a grim set to his jaw. He respected the kill. Objection sustained. Harrison ruled, banging his gavel once. There will be no recess. The witness will answer the court's questions regarding the origin of this document. The doors were locked. The fire was lit. There was no way out. Marcus slumped in his chair, his body language screaming defeat. My father finally turned to look at him. But his expression wasn't one of support, it was pure, unadulterated disgust. He was looking at Marcus like a bad investment he needed to liquidate. I watched the family dynamic dissolve in real time, stripped of its polite veneer. They weren't a dynasty. They were just 3 people, willing to eat each other to survive. Judge Harrison leaned over the bench, his eyes cold and hard as flint. Mr. Whitmore, he said. Start talking. Judge Harrison didn't need to hear much more. The stammering from Marcus was merely background, noise to the decision he had already made. He struck the gavel, a sound that felt like a guillotine blade dropping in the quiet room. "This petition is dismissed with prejudice," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Furthermore, given the evidence of forgery and the misuse of this court's resources, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for immediate review." The words hung there, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't just a loss, it was a verifiable criminal indictment. Marcus collapsed back into his chair as if his strings had been cut. His lawyer was already packing up, creating physical distance between himself and the radioactive client beside him. My father didn't move. He sat frozen, staring at the empty space where his reputation used to be. My mother let out a small, strangled sound, a gasp that was meant to elicit sympathy, but only highlighted her complicity. They looked small. The courtroom, which had felt so imposing an hour ago, now felt like a sterile box trapping them with their own choices. The judge turned his attention to me, his expression softening just enough to be human. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and for the first time, the name sounded like mine, not theirs. "You are free to go. The court apologizes for this waste of your time and resources." I nodded, feeling a strange lightness in my chest. It wasn't happiness. It was the sudden absence of a pressure I had carried since childhood. I looked at Alina. She didn't smile, but she closed her file with a decisive snap. The war was officially over. We gathered our documents, the stack of forensic audits and bank records that had served as my shield. I moved with deliberate slowness, refusing to rush. Across the aisle, the paralysis was total. Marcus was whispering frantically to his attorney, who was shaking his head with professional detachment. My father finally stood up, smoothing his suit jacket with trembling hands, trying to regain a dignity that had already evaporated. He couldn't look at me. To look at me would be to acknowledge that I had beaten him at his own game. Walking down the center aisle felt like leaving a funeral for people who were still breathing. The gallery was empty save for a few bored clerks, but the air felt charged with the static of what had just happened. My heels clicked against the linoleum, a steady rhythm of departure. I didn't look back at the defense table. I didn't need to see their faces to know they were broken. I reached the heavy double doors and pushed them open. The hallway air hit me, cooler and fresher than the recycled atmosphere inside. I hadn't made it 10 feet toward the elevators when I heard the doors burst open behind me. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed on the marble floor, desperate and uneven. "Grace!" It was my mother's voice, pitching up into that frantic register she used when she was losing control of a narrative. I stopped but didn't turn around immediately. I took a breath, centering myself against the pull of old habits. Alina stopped beside me, her presence a silent reminder that I didn't have to engage. But I needed to end this properly. I turned to face them. My mother reached me first, her face flushed, mascara slightly smudged beneath her eyes. She reached for my arm, her grip tight and frantic. "Grace, you have to understand," she pleaded, the words tumbling out. "We were terrified for you. We just wanted to protect you from making mistakes." She actually believed it. She had rewritten the attempted destruction of my company as an act of maternal love. It was a delusion, so complete it was almost impressive. She wanted gratitude for the knife she had put in my back. My father arrived a second later, Marcus trailing behind him like a beaten dog. Dad wasn't sad, he was furious. The embarrassment of the criminal referral was already curdling into blame. "You humiliated your brother in there," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "Was that necessary? Dragging the family name through the mud because you couldn't pick up a phone." He was still trying to be the patriarch, still trying to scold me into submission. He didn't realize his authority had been dismissed along with the petition. He was shouting at a ghost. I looked at my mother's hand on my arm, then up at her face. I gently but firmly removed her grip, stepping back to create a physical boundary. "You weren't trying to help me," I said, my voice calm and level. "You were trying to own me. You forged documents. You lied to a federal judge. That isn't protection, Mother. That is a felony." The word hit her like a physical slap. She recoiled, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for a rebuttal that didn't exist. I turned to my father. "And as for the family name," I continued, holding his gaze until he blinked, "you are the one who destroyed it today. I just told the truth. If the truth ruins you, that is your problem, not mine." The power dynamic flipped instantly. For years, I had craved his approval, terrified of his judgment. Now, standing in that hallway, I saw him clearly, a small, frightened man who would burn his children to keep himself warm. The fear was gone. All that remained was a dull, gray pity. Marcus didn't say a word. He stood against the wall, pale and sweating, staring at the floor. He knew what was coming. The district attorney wouldn't care about his last name or his country club membership. He was looking at indictments, legal fees, and a life stripped of the unearned comfort he had always known. I almost felt sorry for him. He was a weapon my parents had fired and then discarded when he missed the target. "Good luck, Marcus," I said softly. "You are going to need a better lawyer." My mother started to sob, a real, ugly sound this time, realizing the bridge wasn't just burned but demolished. "We're your family," she wailed, playing her final card. "You can't just walk away." I looked at them. The weeping mother, the seething father, the broken brother. "I am not walking away," I corrected her, feeling the truth settle in my bones. "I am already gone. I was gone the day you decided my success was a threat." I turned my back on them, the action feeling final and irreversible. The elevator doors chimed and slid open, a portal to a different life. Elena stepped in, holding the door for me. I walked into the car and turned around. My family stood at the end of the hallway. A tableau of dysfunction frozen in the harsh fluorescent light. As the doors began to close, slicing off the view of their desperation, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel anger. I felt the profound, quiet peace of a prisoner who realizes the cell door was never actually locked. The descent began. 3 months later, the morning light hit my corner office differently. It wasn't filtering through blinds in a cramped apartment anymore. It was flooding across a mahogany desk I had bought with cash. On the muted television mounted on the far wall, a local news chyron flashed a familiar name. "Whitmore investigation expands," it read. The anchor spoke about seized assets and plea deals. I watched for a moment, sipping my coffee. The image of Marcus hiding his face from cameras didn't spark joy or pity. It just felt like watching a weather report for a storm that had finally passed out to sea. My assistant knocked, breaking the trance. "The Forbes photographer is here for the follow-up," she said. "A year ago." The thought of a camera lens pointed at my face would have sent me into a panic. I would have worn a hoodie and asked to remain anonymous. Today, I stood up and smoothed my blazer. I wasn't hiding behind a generic title or a male co-founder anymore. The article was about female CEOs in logistics, and my name was going to be in the headline. I walked to the door, checking my reflection. I didn't see a terrified daughter, I saw a builder. The photo shoot was quick, efficient, and surprisingly painless. Afterward, I met James for lunch at the bistro downstairs. He looked different too. Lighter, as if he wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. We talked about renovations for the house we had just closed on, arguing playfully about tile colors. There were no hushed whispers about them, or strategic conversations about how to dodge the next family holiday. The silence between us wasn't heavy with secrets anymore. It was just peace. We held hands across the table, grounded in a reality where our success belonged only to us. They had tried to call, of course. In the weeks following the hearing, my blocked folder filled up with voicemails from numbers I didn't recognize. Elena handled the legal harassment, ensuring the restraining orders stuck. I listened to one message, just one, from my father. He sounded old. He spoke about legacy and misunderstandings, still unable to say the word sorry. He wanted a meeting to clarify terms. I deleted it without finishing the recording. That was the moment I realized they weren't monsters under the bed. They were just sad, small people losing their grip on a changing world. Back in my office, I walked over to the gallery wall behind my desk. Among the patent approvals and industry awards, one frame stood out. It was a simple black frame containing the first page of the involuntary bankruptcy petition Marcus had filed. Visitors assumed it was some weird motivating memento, a reminder of a hurdle I overcame. They were half right. It wasn't a hurdle. It was a certificate of liberation. It was the document that proved exactly what I was worth to them. $2 million and a lifetime of silence. I kept it to remember the price. The intercom buzzed again. "The development team is ready for the quarterly review," my assistant said. I grabbed my tablet and headed for the conference room. The hallway was buzzing with energy. Coders debating logic, sales teams celebrating wins. This was the family I had chosen. We built things based on merit, not blood. If someone failed here, we fixed the system, we didn't gaslight the person. Walking through the glass doors, I felt a surge of pride. This ecosystem thrived because it was built on truth. No one here had to hide their talent to keep the peace. I learned something vital in that courtroom that no business school could teach. Family isn't defined by the people who share your last name or your DNA. It is defined by the people who stand beside you when the truth gets uncomfortable. My parents only loved me when I was small enough to control. When I outgrew the box they built for me, they called it betrayal. But standing at the head of the conference table, looking at the team waiting for my lead, I knew the reality. Betrayal is demanding someone shrink so you can feel tall. I opened the meeting with a simple question. What are we building next? The room erupted into ideas, voices overlapping in a chaotic, beautiful symphony of ambition. I didn't need to look at the framed petition on my wall to know I was safe. I didn't need to check my blocked messages to know I was free. My father was right about one thing that night at dinner. Surviving isn't thriving. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I didn't win by watching them fall. I won by standing still while the truth held, and finally, simply breathing.